Philip II by William Thomas Walsh. Chapter 1. Philip is born and Rome is sacked. 1527. Before the ominous year 1527, when his son Philip was born, his sacred Caesarial Catholic Majesty Charles V seemed more fortunate almost than any man could safely be. Ruler of the vastest empire the world had ever known, husband at 26 of the most beautiful woman in Europe, he was prolonging an idyllic honeymoon in the incredible halls and gardens of the Alhambra, while the crazy world rushed onward to its own doom or took its troubles to his council at Toledo. Living in a palace that Solomon might envy, with no reasonable human desire unsatisfied, he must have had occasion often enough to thank the spirits of his immortal grandparents, Ferdinand and Isabel, for such a summer as he could never hope to enjoy again. It was they who had conquered this fertile Vega that he looked down on, those snow-capped mountains all about, these incomparable terraces and bowers where the nightingales sang among the oleanders in the moonlight. It was from one of these shady-tiled courts of dead caliphs that they had had the good sense to send Columbus over the Western Ocean to add whole continents to the Spain they had resurrected and freed from the yoke of 8 centuries. Because they had had the foresight to marry Charles's mother, Joanna, now half mad at Tordesillas, to Philip of Austria, their grandson now ruled Germany and Austria as Roman Emperor. Because their only son had died without heirs, Charles was now king of all Spain, Naples, Sicily, and the newly discovered kingdoms beyond the Atlantic, even to the Philippines. Because his paternal grandmother had been of the House of Burgundy, he was Lord of Holland and the Netherlands, Franche-Comté, and other fiefs of that lordly line. While the crown of Charlemagne and Barbarossa was being placed on his chestnut hair at Aix-la-Chapelle, Magellan's men were bearing his standard around the globe. His blue eyes, sometimes masterful and sometimes melancholy, had turned down sceptically upon Luther at the Diet of Worms, while he murmured in the clipped chestnut beard that covered his jutting Habsburg chin, "It will not be this little monk who will make a heretic of me." He had been king but 9 years, emperor 7. His chief struggle thus far, the hereditary one with France, had ended only a year ago with victory at Pavia and with the capture of Francis I himself, after all his insolence and treachery. That stroke had made Charles master of Milan and all Lombardy, virtually therefore of all Italy. More than that, as lord of both northern and southern Italy, he was in a position to squeeze the ruling Medici Pope, Clement VII, between two blades, as it were, of a pair of scissors. In short, the papacy, which had been brought to the verge of ruin by French domination a century or two ago, and everyone knew what laxity and corruption had spread through Christendom in consequence, had fallen under the aegis of Spain, to remain there apparently for many years. Charles felt that to be an excellent thing for the Church. It certainly had its advantages for Caesar, and Charles was Caesar. Nothing was lacking to his happiness now, except the birth of an heir. As his wife had conceived in August of that year 1526, it seemed very likely that the last desirable drop would be added to their brimming cup. Who could have foreseen that a marriage of convenience could prove so ideal? Charles had had little thought of love when, after jilting young Mary Tudor, he had been united to Isabel in March, in the hall of the ambassadors at Seville, where their grandmother had sentenced so many male malefactors to death half a century ago. His wife was his first cousin, a daughter of his Aunt Maria and of King Manuel the Fortunate of Portugal. Charles made no secret of the fact that he was marrying her because she could rule Spain for him, if necessary, in his absence on the wars and journeys he contemplated, and, even more important, because she brought a dowry of 1,000,000 ducats at a most opportune time. 3 years younger than Charles, the Empress was slender and shapely, with the fair skin and delicate pink colouring of their grandmother, her namesake, though more feminine, and, judging by the portraits of Titian, Coelho, and others, much more beautiful. Her eyes were blue, like her husband's, but much darker. Her brows long and tapering into lines charmingly irregular, her brow smooth and fine, fairly wide and rounded, so that it suggested somehow a well-balanced, harmonious personality. Her lower lip somewhat full, but less so than her Habsburg husband's, her upper one a marked Cupid's bow, her thick, long hair a golden brown, altogether a northern rather than a southern type, and by common consent a most lovable, devoted woman. Charles became so infatuated with her that he never willingly left Spain while she lived. He loved her until the day of his death. To please her that summer, he began building a Renaissance palace, the unfinished walls of which may still be seen at Granada. Because she liked the warm south, he planned to establish his capital there, in spite of several practical objections. What are practical objections to a young bridegroom? Even in death they would make this place their home. The young Empress wished to lie, when her time came, in the dimly lighted vault, where 2 leaden coffins held all that remained of the majesty of Ferdinand and Isabel. Certain it is that during her lifetime Charles paid no attention to any other woman, and that he relied on his wife's judgment and tact more than upon any of his counsellors. He was well aware that his education had been inferior in many respects to hers. In Flanders, under the shrewd eye of his grandfather, the Emperor Maximilian I, he had rather specialised in military law and statecraft. His favourite books were Caesar's Commentaries, the De Consolatione of Boethius, the Meditations of St. Augustine, Comines' Memoirs. With philosophy and theology he had scant acquaintance. Music was a passion with him, and he knew enough of art to be the enthusiastic patron of Titian. Besides Spanish, he spoke French, Flemish, and Italian. He loved pet birds and animals, and at one time had a parrot and 2 Indian cats. Flowers, too, were always a preoccupation with him. If the Indian pink still grows in European gardens, it is because Charles sent home some specimens from Tunis. With something of the charm and joie de vivre of his volatile father, he combined the more solid qualities of Los Reyes Católicos, transmitted to him through his unfortunate mother, industry and will, great personal courage, fortitude in adversity, though in good fortune he was sometimes too elated, a shrewd common sense that saw through most men and appearances, but not all, and a considerable humility in the presence of God, except when anger mastered him. He spoke softly, and on ordinary occasions wore a plain black suit, sometimes shabby, with no ornament but a gold chain around his neck. A huge feeder, he loved his ale at 5 in the morning, and a heavy supper at midnight, and was known to drink a quart or more of Rhenish wine with his dinner of several meat courses at noon. While Charles was lingering with his Empress under a brilliant sky among laurels and roses, the medieval world into which he had been born was rapidly becoming that bewildering modern world on which he would turn his back at last in disillusioned weariness. When he went to Granada that spring, it might have been said that he was one of the 4 men in whose power it lay, perhaps, to change the destinies of the Western world. He and his rival, Francis I, his uncle Henry VIII, and Pope Clement VII. If these 4 in 1526 had been of one mind, a modicum of common sense and courage would have sufficed to reconcile the powers of Christendom and to unite their tremendous material forces against the Turks who had been battering at the east and south for nearly 1,000 years. Of all the 4, Charles was the most powerful, the most apt for government and for war, and the most keenly aware of the need of grappling immediately with the issues raised by Luther and the other insurgents in the north. With the accession of Charles, the historical mission of the moribund Holy Roman Empire, the defence of the Church and of Christian civilization, had passed through him to Spain. Spain, made great by thrusting back the conquering Moors and scattering the dominant Jews to the 4 winds. Spain, whose infantry was invincible on the battlefields of Europe. Spain, whose fleets dominated the Atlantic and all the vast New World. In the peninsula, with the suppression of the Comunidades, the things of Caesar and the things of God seemed to have reached almost an equilibrium, with which most were satisfied. The Spanish Church was reformed, vigorous and militantly Catholic. The people prosperous, the democracy and the crown reasonably balanced. Why not in Europe and in all the world? Fleet-footed destiny passed by, however, at a moment when Charles was looking in another direction. Never again would he seem to hold the fate of the world in his hands so firmly as when he kept the sons of Francis as hostages, intimidated the hesitant Medici Pope with his tercios, and knew that on the English throne a friendly Spanish queen, his cousin, would support his policies as much as she was able. For, while he lingered beside the fountains of the Generalife and walked down with his adored Empress among the blossoms of pomegranate and white jasmine, time was weaving a web of cause and effect from which he would never find a sword to cut himself wholly free. Only a month before Charles's wedding he had set Francis at liberty, on his signing a treaty, with the most solemn oaths, relinquishing his claims to Burgundy and Milan. It was not long before the French king was organising a new league against his conqueror under pretext of defending the independence of Italy and the freedom of the Church. Florence, Venice, and Francesco Sforza joined it. So did the cold and scholarly Clement VII, driven by the necessities of the situation, as he thought, to follow the variable policy of his cousin Pope Leo X. In this view, it was dangerous for the Church to be hemmed in between Naples and Milan. If both fell into the same hands, if both belonged to a foreigner, whether French or Spanish, so much the worse. The nepotism of these popes was partly the expression of a conviction, born of sad experience, that in European politics one could trust only one's own relatives, and not always them. Clement was a true Medici in his devotion to family interests, but he desired the freedom of the Church as ardently as greater popes had desired it. In his mind, the Catholic fervour of the kings of Spain did not make them any more welcome than the less orthodox kings of France, when it came to gobbling up huge portions of Italy and half smothering the Roman court with embraces. So Clement easily fell in with the new designs of perjured Francis. Charles had a rude awakening from his honeymoon. Short of money, as kings usually were, and deeply in debt to Henry VIII, not to mention various bankers, he found himself with a poorly paid, half-mutinous army on his hands, and that army menaced by the papal forces from the south, the Venetians from the east, and the furious peasantry of Lombardy and Piedmont from the north. As reinforcements were being rushed from Germany and Spain, with no certainty of arriving on time or of being paid when they arrived, some of the Emperor's diplomats in Italy advised him to teach the Pope a thorough lesson. There is a question perhaps as to how far Charles was willing to go in this direction. But there is no doubt that his creature, the uncouth and insolent Don Ugo de Moncada, proceeded to administer the instruction in a startling and portentous manner. Coming to terms with the Pope's enemy, Cardinal Pompeo Colonna, Ugo led some of the imperial troops, with 8,000 armed Colonnese peasants, into Rome, sacked the Vatican and St. Peter's, and forced Clement to flee to the castle of San Angelo. All Christendom, naturally, was indignant, but worse was to follow. Even the desecration of St. Peter's on September 20th was half forgotten when it became known on October 1st that the Turk had won a crushing victory over the Christians at Mohocs. Charles's brother-in-law, King Louis of Hungary, had perished in the rout with 7 of the 12 Hungarian bishops. The Mohammedans were ravaging the countryside, burning and wasting and slaying. All Hungary on the farther side of the Danube was theirs. God knew how long the other side would remain in Christian hands. The eastern gate to Christendom was wide open. The Grand Turk, Suleiman the Magnificent, was in the field with tremendous forces and reserves. Christian princes, instead of being united in the defence of Christ and Christ's people, were bickering and slaughtering Christians to avenge insults or to gain more land or power. Charles was comfortably ignorant of all this when autumn began to mellow the fruits of the lovely valleys at his feet. It was October 4th when his secretary, Perez, wrote him from Rome that the Pope, on hearing the news from Hungary, had burst into tears, and that the Holy Father had spoken of making a journey to France and to Spain in the interests of Christian peace. Some say, added the secretary with worldly cynicism, that if he goes he will not get beyond France, but will stay at Avignon. Perez might have been even more certain of a second exile of the Pope as guest of the King of France, if he had known then, at that very moment when Francis I was forming the Holy League for the defence of Italy and the Church, he was secretly encouraging the Grand Turk's invasion of Hungary as a means of injuring Charles. 2 days after Perez wrote him, it often took a month or more in bad weather for a letter to go from Rome to Spain, His sacred imperial and Catholic majesty was communicating in lofty and aggrieved terms with the whole college of cardinals, complaining of the Pope's ill treatment of him generally, and of the criticisms his enemies were circulating in Rome. Upon his elevation to the imperial dignity, it had been his firm purpose, he declared, not to extend the limits of the empire, yet the fears of his aggrandizement soon plunged the whole of Christendom into war. It was high time that peace should be restored. With this intent he had gone to Germany and had tried to reconcile princes who were quarrelling with one another there. Yet while he was engaged in this work, well worthy of an emperor, the King of France, quem uti patrem colebamus, seized every opportunity to do him harm, forcing him at last to have recourse to arms. Divine justice, however, had triumphed at Pavia in 1525. Charles had released Francis and had written the Pope and all Christian princes, asking them to ratify the treaty then signed. Yet new disturbances had been fomented by the Pope himself. Charles concluded his catalogue of wrongs by begging the Pope to convoke a general council for the reform of the Church. Clement, he added bitterly, had put off this duty and was now denouncing Charles as a disturber of the peace and as the enemy of Christendom. This letter may have seemed a little flat when it reached a Rome already prostrate by the invasion of the Colonnesi and by the sickening news from the east. But Charles was very much in earnest, very angry, and not a little alarmed. He gave peremptory orders and waited impatiently for further news. This was the moment when all his armies ought to have been concentrated in Hungary to assist his sister Mary to hold the kingdom against the Turks. Yet they were marching into Italy, where he already had more men than he could decently pay for, to frighten the Pope and the French. The world was about to witness the monstrous spectacle of an invasion of Catholic Italy by a Spanish army made up almost exclusively of non-Catholics. The Spaniards, who had been recruited so hastily in Alicante, Cartagena, Valencia, and elsewhere in eastern Spain, were mostly Moriscos, the shallowness of whose pretense to be Catholics was soon demonstrated by their demand, during a mutiny, to be allowed to practice the Mohammedan religion. The German Landsknechts, sharked up almost overnight by Bourbon and rushed over the Alps, were chiefly Lutherans, furnished by the Prince of Mindelheim, one of the most fervent dissenters who ever inveighed against the whore of Babylon. There were upwards of 20,000 of them in Italy that winter, among them many criminals and adventurers, the offscorings and sweepings of Europe, men who hated the Mass and would like nothing better than to sack a Catholic church, a sort of black legion of heresy, paradoxically in the pay of his imperial Catholic majesty. In Rome they were often referred to derisively as the Jews, or the Marani, since so many ostensible Catholics in Spain were converts, real or pretended, of Jewish descent. It did not improve matters for Charles to receive a most patronising letter from Henry VIII, especially when that champion of Catholic unity had just been honoured by the Pope with the title of Protector of the Holy League against Charles. It was not the first time Henry had been given a papal designation. He had been called Defender of the Faith for his vigorous reply to Luther's attacks on the authority of Rome. Luther had replied to Henry's arguments in characteristic fashion. He had called the English king a pig, an ass, a dunghill, the spawn of an adder, a basilisk, a lying buffoon dressed in a king's robes, a mad fool with a frothy mouth and whorish face. This did not deter Henry from writing the most Catholic admonition conceivable for his ambassador, Dr. Lee, to communicate to our beloved nephew, the Emperor. He was very glad that Charles wished him to mediate for peace in Europe. For, in the state in which Christendom is, a prompt remedy is required. Should the Kingdom of Hungary, one of the strongest bulwarks of Christendom on that side, remain in the hands of the infidel, there is no knowing what harm might be done to our holy religion. For unless the Christian princes, now engaged in intestine wars, lay down their arms, and make a general league for the repulse of the said Turks, they will inevitably overrun Germany. We have just written to our Holy Father the Pope, and to our good brother the King of France, asking them to send ambassadors to England, so that mediation could be undertaken there, and a league formed to repel the Turk. Similar exhortations must be addressed by you to our most beloved brother and nephew, the Emperor. You are also to inform our beloved nephew, the Emperor, how shocked we were to hear of the odious and unheard of outrage committed by Don Ingo de Moncada, the Colonnesi, and other of their adherents against the Pope's person, the particulars of which outrage we have no doubt have reached the Emperor's ears long before this. We are sure not only that the Emperor did not authorize or consent to such injurious treatment, but that he will be highly displeased at it, just as any other Christian prince would be in a similar case. For really, if the thing happened as related to us, there never was such an insult committed, not even by the Vandals, Goths, or any other barbarous nation, which execrable act is the more to be detested since, as we are informed, imperial soldiers despoiled and plundered the church of St. Peter and other temples and houses consecrated to God, and made most abominable uses of the vases and ornaments of the same, such as was never before seen, read, or heard of, to God's great displeasure, to the infamy and shame of the offenders, and notable dishonour of the Apostolic See. Under the conviction, however, that such heinous acts have been committed without the Emperor's consent or advice, we have done, and are still doing, all that is in our power to mitigate, soften, and excuse the same, asking the Pope and other Christian princes to bear the same patiently. Henry asked Charles to postpone his contemplated crowning in Rome if he really desired peace, and, with regard to the debt he owes us, hearing Don Inigo de Mendoza's explanations on the subject, we intend to act with all reason so that everything may be settled to his satisfaction. Charles remained in Granada with the Empress until December. It was too late to take the field against the Turks. They were already retreating into Transylvania to spend the winter there, though the Emperor's agents wrote that they would surely return in the spring and probably make a thrust at Vienna. The news from Italy was quite as disturbing in a way. All through October and November there came urgent appeals for money. The troops were threatening to sack Milan if they were not paid. On November 9th, Charles wrote Erasmus of Rotterdam his congratulations on having become ex professo an enemy of Luther, and exhorted the great scholar to continue in that path. On the 16th he wrote Najera that he was remitting bills of exchange for the support of the Italian army, and hoped all would be well, adding, "Though God Almighty is witness, that we would much rather employ our resources and means to lessen the power of the Turk, and to prevent the dangers and calamities which threaten Christianity. If the question be asked, why then did he not do so, the answer is obvious enough. It would have cost him something, probably the loss of Italy. Who could expect a great emperor, satiated with love and wine, to be quixotic to the point of suffering material loss? So Charles scraped together all the money he could to oppose the Pope and the Pope's friends in Italy. On November 24th, he gave Dr. Lee a comprehensive reply to deliver to his uncle Henry in London. He was still in Granada December 13th. Just before Christmas, we find him back in his capital at Toledo. On the way north, he may have passed through Alcalá de Henares, where the same year there languished for a month in the dungeons of the Inquisition a former soldier, one Ignatius of Loyola. Because of his somewhat unconventional piety, this man was suspected by the watchful Dominicans of being perhaps one of the alumbrados, self-styled illuminates and pseudo-mystics, who went about like wolves in sheep's clothing, seducing the little ones of Christ. Ignatius also had some ideas about saving Christendom. When Charles heard of them, he had a very poor opinion of him. The Empress, now heavy with child, followed her lord north. They spent Christmas at Toledo. Afterwards she went to Segovia, where Charles proceeded to Valladolid in Old Castile to preside at the opening of the Cortes, from which he had hoped to obtain some money. The democratic institutions of Spain, earliest in Europe, had been a great handicap to him. France was a highly concentrated despotism, whose ruler could wring money from nobles and clergy at his will, but in Castile and in all the other possessions of Charles, there was no supply without the consent of the people's representatives. Charles had once asked the French king during a friendly interlude, "How much can you raise from your subjects?" Francis was able to say, "As much as I please." Not so Charles. When the Cortes met late in January, the delegates were very cool to his request. They let it be known that they did not look with favour upon his leaving Spain at that time. His court was full of Flemings who were greatly disliked by the Castilians. Moreover, the revolt of the Comunidades, in part a protest against the Germanization of the court, was still a recent scandal, and the presence of the emperor might be required. While the Cortes continued its long, exasperating deliberations, Charles left by post for Segovia, February 7th, to meet the Empress, who entered the city that day with great pomp and acclaim. The people, having learned of her pregnancy, were holding processions, burning candles, promising barefoot pilgrimages, and even flagellating themselves, that God might grant her a safe delivery, and the emperor an heir to whom he might leave the world. Charles remained in Segovia with his wife for nearly 2 weeks. Better news was on the way from Italy. The abbot of Nájera wrote that the Spanish infantry at Milan had received part of their pay, and in consequence had consented to march. 62,404 scudi had been furnished by the burghers of Milan, with what suppressed groans may be imagined. The rest of the sum had been made up out of the silver of the churches, melted down. The army was now marching towards the enemy's territory, without a farthing, pelted by cold rain and snow. With such a force approaching, the Pope was very anxious to make peace with the Emperor's viceroy. The imperial troops were in high good humour, thinking they were going to Florence, where the loot was infinite. Florence belonged to the Pope's family, a fact that gave him a little anxiety. Meanwhile, Charles conducted the Empress to Valladolid. The chief noblemen and clergy of the place met them outside the walls of the ancient Roman city. Tenderly and with bated breath, they carried her in a litter on their shoulders through the gates and up the sloping streets to the Plaza Mayor and the royal palace. That day Valladolid became the capital of Spain and of the empire. One imagines the Empress and her chivalrous attendants wrapped in fine Castilian woolen mantles, only their faces exposed to the biting wind, as they passed slowly to the Plaza Mayor, where Alvaro de Luna had lost his head, and entered the palace where Ferdinand and Isabella had been married 60 years before. The Empress was made as comfortable as possible, in spacious rooms heated by huge braziers of brass or iron, and hung with rare tapestries from Flanders and paintings from Italy. There, with many prayers, she reconciled herself to waiting, while the Emperor busied himself with the problems of war and finance. From all parts of Europe, Charles was getting intelligence that disturbed him. Henry VIII and Francis had undoubtedly joined forces against him. It was said that Francis wished to marry the Princess Mary, Henry's daughter by Catherine of Aragon. Wolsey was going to Rome. Sir John Russell, Henry's ambassador in Italy, had raised 30,000 ducats there to aid the Pope. Bourbon, at the head of Charles's main force of Lutherans and Moriscos, was a mile from Bologna on March 16th, and nobody knew where he was going. The Duke of Ferrara brought off the Lutherans with 15,000 ducats raised from the bankers of Ferrara, and so prevented the sack of his city. But the Germans took all the money, and would not let the Spaniards have any, in consequence of which the latter left the camp, and the Germans, in mutiny, sacked Bourbon's quarters, crying, "Guelte, Guelte!" By March 20th, the mutiny was suppressed, but the abbot of Nájera wrote Charles he did not know whether the troops would go on to Rome or to Florence. The Landsknechts had defied the authority of Bourbon, and were forcing him to go along with them, in fear of his life. When Pope Clement learned of this, he provided 100,000 ducats for the Germans, to keep them out of his beloved Florence. It was thought now, wrote Secretary Perez to Charles, that they would go to Venice, which no doubt would serve the treacherous Venetians right for their opposition to the Emperor. Bourbon, virtually the prisoner of his own army, asked the Pope for 150,000 ducats more, but the Pope was unable to meet the demand. The Spanish, now in league with the Germans, presumably after receiving part of the Pope's money, were marching in beautiful order, wrote Perez on April 8th. In Rome it was believed that Bourbon could make the men return to Milan if he wished. Not only was Francis in league with the Grand Turk, but Suleiman had given the Signory of Venice 500 weight of saltpetre to make gunpowder, for use, it would seem, against the imperialists. Lannoy, the viceroy of Charles, went to Florence. From there he wrote the Pope demanding 200,000 ducats for his army. Clement hesitated, fearing that the scoundrels would take his money and then go to Rome for more. So wrote Perez on April 18th, when the troops were making forced marches and were only 30 miles from Florence, but apparently headed for Rome. "It is said the Pope will create some cardinals and thus procure money," wrote Perez on the 26th. The imperial troops were following literally the advice that Ferdinand the Catholic used to give Gonsalvo de Cordoba, when the great captain demanded money to buy food for his troops in Italy. "Let them live off the country." On the last day of April, Perez reported that the bewildered Pope had found his courage at last. He had refused 300,000 ducats demanded by the troops, declaring he would spend them on the defence of his country and the church, and he was already enlisting troops. The Germans were moving towards Siena. On the same day, a treaty of peace was concluded between France and England. The English commissioners included Thomas, Duke of Norfolk, Thomas Boleyn, Viscount Rochefort, and Thomas More, Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, names soon to acquire a new significance in history. It was rumoured in France that Henry VIII would invade Charles's estates in Flanders, while Francis would renew the war elsewhere. Venice and the Pope were on their side. To make matters worse, if possible, Charles had on his richly carved desk in the Palace of the Viveros an insolent letter from Dr. Lee, Henry's ambassador, demanding payment of the 40,000 florins owed by Charles's grandfather Maximilian, the 35,000 borrowed by Charles, his bond of 150,000 florins signed in 1522 for 1 year, and the indemnity of 133,305 crowns per year he had promised 3 years ago, but had never paid. Meanwhile, the Cortes still refused, after so much talk, to grant a subsidy. Outside, the May sun was shining. The rarefied air, like a pale southern wine, was alive with the laughter of children playing, the cries of farmers driving their bullock carts to the ploughing and seeding of rich lands along the Duero, the ringing of bells in a dozen churches and convents, and the tramping of penitents going to shrines and holy crosses to pray for the Empress, now in her last month of waiting. It was a good and peaceful world here on the ancient Castilian hills that had been won back from the Moors with so much cost of blood through weary centuries. The moon, good augury for a boy, was on the wane. Lent was over. The long winter was gone. The fresh air was full of the fragrance of orange blossoms and roses. It was pouring rain, however, when at last the Empress, her face covered in accord with convention, was delivered of a son at 4 o'clock on the afternoon of the 21st. As soon as the royal might was wrapped in swaddling clothes, the Emperor came joyfully in and took him in his arms, saying, "May our God make thee a good Christian. I beg our Lord God to give thee his grace. May it please our Lord God to enlighten thee, that thou mayest know how to govern the kingdom thou shalt inherit." Through dripping Valladolid, and thence through all of Spain, arose a cry of joy. Guns were firing in the forts. The silver bells of which every village was proud mingled their various tones in thanksgiving to God, who had provided an heir for such a large and turbulent portion of the globe. While grandees and cavaliers were hurrying to the palace with their felicitations, the Emperor went on foot through the heavy rain to the church of St. Paul, to give thanks to our Lord for the blessing received. On Saturday, June 2nd, the royal child was carried through a secret doorway from the palace into the Dominican church of St. Paul, along a carved way strewn with roses and lemon and orange blossoms. There he was baptized with all the magnificence the Spanish loved for such occasions. The Archbishop of Toledo, Don Alonso de Fonseca, Primate of Spain, performed the ceremony in one of the chapels of San Pablo. The font was a very large basin of solid silver. None of the contemporary accounts gives any hint that the tiny child behaved differently from other babies under like circumstances, or that the grandees, ambassadors, or prelates present had the slightest premonition that any historian would ever call him the Black Demon of the South. He was not indeed very dark, on the contrary fair, his hair quite blonde when the first fuzz wore off, and his eyes, when they opened on this complex world, blue. Many wanted him called Fernando, after his illustrious great-grandfather. The Duke of Alba insisted upon this, even at the font, but the Emperor had decided upon the name of his own father, Philip the Handsome, and the herald cried, "Oid, oid, oid, Don Felipe, Príncipe de Castilla por la gracia de Dios." The whole court abandoned itself to a delirium of celebration. Feasts, banquets, and tournaments, bullfights, and such characteristically Spanish games as juegos de canas and pelota were to give voice to the people's joy for many days. No less than 200 knights would take part in the jousts, wrote the ambassador of the King of Bohemia to his master just before the baptism, and he added, "There is consequently a great lull in politics, and the courtiers think of nothing save the rejoicings that are in preparation. It is true that the Emperor wonders why he has not heard from His Highness since February 15 last. There is good news from Italy. The army is in fine condition, and anxious to come to close quarters with the enemy. An ambassador from England is expected, and another from France. They come, it is said, to make certain proposals for the cessation of hostilities, but there is no believing their words, and though His Imperial Majesty is as desirous as ever for peace, he is not likely to trust them." It was then, while the feasts were beginning, and the Emperor's courtiers were speeding to every capital in Europe with the glad tidings, that news came from Italy that fell on Catholic minds with the stunning effects of a thunderbolt. The imperial army, after wandering about for many days, looking for plunder, had swiftly marched on Rome, demanded entrance, and were refused. Though Bourbon had no artillery, he led an attack on the walls at dawn, May 6th. Mounting a scaling ladder, he was shot down by a hackbutt, and died almost immediately. His Lutherans and Moriscos, now without a commander, and half mad with lust for gold and with hatred of the Catholic Church, swarmed over the walls between the Belvedere and the gate of St. Pancras, gained the Borgo, and commenced to slay and burn. They sacked the sacred capital of Christendom with more cruel ruthlessness than anything history had ever recorded, even of Attila or the Vandals or the Goths. Rome was utterly ruined. It would never be the same again. The blow was so sudden and so terrible that several days passed before Charles' ambassadors could send him coherent accounts of it. The news reached England almost as soon, through Venice. Early in June, accounts full of incredible details began to pour into festive Valladolid. The soldiers of His Sacred Imperial and Catholic Majesty had stormed the Vatican. As Pope Clement and some of the cardinals were hastily departing to take refuge in the castle of St. Angelo, the Spaniards fired their hackbutts at the Supreme Pontiff. "So narrow was the Pope's escape," wrote Salazar, one of the eyewitnesses, that had he tarried for 3 credos more, he would have been taken prisoner within his own palace. While Clement was preparing to defend himself in St. Angelo, the imperialists went about slaying every man they met, until, if Salazar may be believed, there were 6,000 to 8,000 dead. Only 100 imperialists were killed, most of them by balls from cannon that had been begun firing from the castle walls, some perhaps from the one that Benvenuto Cellini fired so manfully and afterwards wrote about so boastfully. From the Borgo, the soldiers ran through the city committing unexampled atrocities, putting people of all nationalities to the sword, or torturing them to make them confess where money was hidden. Gold! Gold! Nearly 1 million ducats were taken from the Portuguese ambassador and his friends. All the cardinals remaining in Rome were compelled to pay ransom, and were herded to prison through the streets, bareheaded like criminals. Salazar saw the Cardinal of Siena, with a tabard or short jacket on, being dragged over the rough pavements by 10 landsknechts. The heartrending cries of women and children shivered through the streets as they were herded along by the barbarians, over heaped-up treasures from the houses of the rich, and over dead bodies that piled up day after day, until the stench became insufferable. Gold! Gold! The Lutherans, spurred by fanaticism as well as by greed, broke into the monasteries and convents, slew many friars, priests, and nuns, goaded others out to prison or torture. Nuns with no money to pay for ransom were dragged through the streets between files of soldiers. Not only was the Vatican wrecked and plundered, and its rich and gorgeous apartments turned into stables for the horses of Charles's Lutheran cavalry, who took a barbaric pleasure in destroying the art treasures of Michelangelo's generous patron, but St. Peter's was completely sacked. 30 men who took refuge there were butchered at the very altar, and others after them as days went on, until they lay in tangled, rotting piles. Many dead bodies lay about, wrote Salazar, so much disfigured that it was impossible to recognize them, and in the chapel itself, close to the altar of St. Peter, were great pools of blood, dead horses, and so on. Among these fearful objects of carnage were strewn priceless relics of the saints, contemptuously thrown out by savage and bloody bands that seized silver shrines, caskets, and reliquaries. The churches in general, after having been plundered of their ornaments of silver and their custodias, have been desecrated. In some of them the host could never be found. In short, the atrocities surpass all bounds and cannot be described. It seems all like a dream, wrote Salazar. Perez also informed the emperor that the consecrated vessels containing the host had been stolen. No doubt the body of Christ was trampled in the dust by the feet of Lutherans and Mohammedans. Flames and smoke began rising in all parts of the stricken city as the troops set fire to houses whose owners had fled or were unable to pay ransom. Priceless art treasures were destroyed. Many artists were killed. The Renaissance in art was summarily ended. Michelangelo did no work for 2 years. Ariosto sadly wrote his Vedete gli homicidici e le rapine in ogni parte for Roma dolente. When the vile news reached Spain, the public grief and rage were unprecedented. In many places, priests and monks preached boldly against the emperor and demanded the cessation of the baptismal festivities at Valladolid. Most of the court and many of the people voluntarily put on mourning and performed public penances in the name of Spain in atonement for the insults done to Christ and his vicar on earth. Charles insisted that the jousts and banquets continue on the ground that the nobility had spent large sums in preparation. But the cry of the people, led openly by the Archbishop of Toledo, the Duke of Alba, and Quinones, general of Franciscans, who dared to tell him that he would be called Captain of the Lutherans, was too much for him. He suspended the celebrations. A sullen quiet descended upon the court. It was almost as if the puny child in his gilded cradle had been found guilty of all the atrocities committed in his father's name, and had been condemned to obloquy beforehand. The superstitious began to see a connection between his birth and the sack of Rome. Some said the orrery was very bad. Philip was born to be the ruin of Christendom. Others predicted that the royal infant would be the veneration, obedience, wealth, shield, and sword of the church. Charles, notwithstanding Grates' rash charge that the sack was ordered by him, seems to have been sincerely shocked and pained by the news. Most historians have exonerated him, at least from deliberate intention, but even his expressions of regret were not without some hint of satisfaction over the furtherance of his own political interests. He wrote explanations to the other rulers of Europe, putting most of the responsibility on the Pope himself and on Almighty God. The Pope having made war on him, he had concluded a truce with him, but the army, fearing the Pope would break this second truce, as he had the first with Don Hugo, had taken things into his own hands. Though we firmly believe that the Roman disaster was more owing to a visitation of the Almighty than to the power and will of man, and that God, on whom we place all our trust, permitted that the injuries we had received should be avenged without will or consent of ours, yet we have felt so much the want of respect to the Holy See, that really and truly we should have preferred to be vanquished rather than to come victorious out of such a contest. A similar note of pious hypocrisy, which took no account of the real cause of the sack, irreverence and lust for plunder evoked by the emperor's failure to pay his troops, was sounded by his envoys in Italy, who wrote him explanations and advice. "It was the sentence of God," wrote the abbot of Najera. "May those who executed it be counted not unworthy before him." Secretary Perez was already looking ahead. "The emperor cannot allow the church to lose any of its authority," he wrote unctuously, "but ought, on the contrary, to maintain and favour it, that he may the better rule over Italy and remove the many causes for war that there might otherwise be." Then he added cannily in code, "Should the emperor accomplish his journey to Italy, the Venetians might easily be deprived of all their possessions on the mainland, as they have now nobody to come to their assistance. A good war contribution might be imposed on the Florentines, besides taking away from them Leghorn and Pisa, and demolishing the fortifications of Florence," the work of Leonardo da Vinci, "as a security for the future. For the city is French by affection, and will never remain quiet unless compelled by necessity. But on no account ought Florence to be sacked, for experience has shown that this sacking of towns and cities is by no means beneficial to the emperor's cause, since the soldiers, after such plundering and destruction, still go on clamouring for their arrears of pay. The emperor, once in Italy, permission might easily be obtained from the Pope to alienate the 10th part of the ecclesiastical property throughout his dominions, whence a sum of at least 3 million might be obtained for a war against the Turk and the preservation of Hungary. The Pope would not refuse, for he himself has done the same at Florence. Florence would yield 500,000, Milan 800,000. Cardinal Colonna is of the opinion that on no account ought the emperor to trust the Pope, whatever may be his promises or the securities he offers. He knows his disposition to be so fickle and changeable that no reliance whatever can be placed on him. But even while young Charles was congratulating himself upon the terms his generals were wringing from the Pope, surrender of the Pope and of the cardinals as Charles' prisoners, their ransom of 150,000 scudi del sol, and an additional 200,000 scudi to be wrung by taxation from the estates of the church to pay the imperial soldiers, absolution of the imperial generals from any ecclesiastical censures incurred, notwithstanding all these temporal affairs, there fell almost immediately upon the victorious army a scourge in which the Christian world was quick to see the justice of God avenging the desecration of his holy place. The old bubonic plague, the Black Death itself perhaps, stole without trumpets or drums into the imperial camps in the Borgo di San Pietro and in the trenches around the castle. Before the corpses in St. Peter's had finished rotting, it began to pile up others, fearfully black and spotted in every street. Of the German Landsknechts, 2/3 are said to have perished, and the rest to have met ends worthy of their crimes. The foul enemy penetrated San Angelo and laid some of the papal courtiers dead at the feet of the sorrowing Pope. It did not touch Clement himself. Could anything worse than all these miseries fall upon afflicted Christendom? Those who asked the question in that year 1527 thought not. Charles's aunt, Catherine of England, who had known so many sorrows since that day when she embarked at Corunna before the turn of the century, seems to have had some insight into the end of so much military glory. On May 10th, before she knew of the sack of Rome, she wrote to her imperial nephew from Granuque a pathetic but arresting letter in Spanish. Most high and powerful Lord, I hardly know how to confess the many obligations in which I stand towards your Highness for the many favours conferred upon me. I hold it to be that your Highness has chosen to show sorrow for my death, perceiving that neither my existence nor my services are such as to deserve being recalled to your memory. And yet, trusting in your Highness's innate good kindness and virtue, I will, with the help of God, employ my life in the furtherance of those objects which may be for your Highness's service, though my abilities be scanty and my powers small. As I fear that my letter may be odious to your Highness, as written by one inexperienced in these matters, I shall say no more here than beg and entreat your Highness to have pity on so much bloodshed and perdition of souls so costly and redeemed at such price, bearing in mind that this world is perishable and of short duration, and the next one eternal. There is urgent need that peace between Christian princes be concluded, before God sends down his scourge, which cannot tarry if these quarrels and disagreements continue between Christian princes. If, in the expression of these sentiments, I have given the least offence, I beg your Highness to pardon me. My ignorance alone is the cause. God have you in his keeping. Your good aunt, Katharina. A characteristic letter of the youngest daughter of Ferdinand and Isabel, with nothing in it of any trouble personal to her. Yet within a few months, Charles was to receive from his ambassador in England the startling news that Henry, inflamed with lust for Anne Boleyn, and artfully managed by upstarts and sons of usurers, was planning, but secretly, for fear of a popular uprising in her favour, to divorce her. It was now Charles who caught a terrifying glimpse of the abyss that was only beginning to open before the feet of all Christian men. You may well imagine how sorry we were, he wrote Mendoza, to hear of a case so scandalous in itself and entailing such lamentable consequences for the future, from which evils innumerable must inevitably arise, especially at the present juncture. We cannot desert this queen, our good aunt, in her trouble. Nevertheless, he thought that moderation and kind remonstrances might be best for the present. and he enclosed a letter in his own handwriting, written in cipher, with infinite trouble to ourselves, to be delivered to King Henry. He was anxious just then to draw Henry from his alliance with Francis, which the sack of Rome had cemented. Knowing his great personal virtues, his elevation of mind, his good and righteous intentions, and the perfect love he has always borne towards us and our affairs, we cannot in any manner be persuaded to believe in so strange a determination as this on the part of his Serenity, a step which would so astonish the whole world, were it to be carried into execution. The good qualities of the Queen, the honesty and peace in which they have lived for so many years, to which we may add that having, as they have, so sweet a princess for their daughter, it is not to be presumed that his Serenity would consent to have her or her mother dishonoured, a thing so monstrous of itself and wholly without precedent in ancient or modern history. Nor is it likely that these proceedings originate with his Serenity, but with persons who bear ill will towards his most serene highness, the Queen, and ourselves, and care not what evils and disasters may spring therefrom. How true this was, all Christendom was only to learn too soon. An age was in dissolution. An epoch had come to an end. A strange new phase was being ushered in by wars, plagues, tempests, and all manner of strange phenomena. Diseases unknown or forgotten by history made their appearance. The dancing sickness, whose victims sometimes continued to dance for weeks, attacked whole communities. There had been several epidemics in England of a fatal new disease called the English sweating sickness. It seldom troubled foreigners, while Englishmen abroad died of it. In northern Europe, especially in the new Protestant communities, there was an increase of psychic disorders, hallucinations, and suicides, mass hysteria. The year after the sack of Rome, the French army before Naples was destroyed by spotted fever. For 6 whole years there was famine, with great summer moisture and heat, and warm winters. In 1528, an extensive drought, and swarms of locusts and fiery meteors in northern Germany. In 1529, a bloody rain was reported at Cremona, the torrent of St. Vitus, 4 days of rain and flood in Germany, plague in Vienna and among the Turks who besieged it, a terrifying comet in August. Small wonder that some, like Erasmus, predicted the speedy end of the world, and that long-bearded men in the synagogues and ghettos of many cities, versed in apocalyptic speculations, rejoiced in the news of the sack of Rome, looked for the coming of the Messias, and in Poland, Hungary, Turkey, and remote Asia, heard with hope that one Solomon Molko, a handsome Marano whose relatives had been driven out of Spain, might at last be the long-expected he. Rabbinical prophecies had long held that the fall of Rome would be the sign of his advent. But the end was not yet. Rome was restored. Molko, in spite of the friendship of Pope Clement, was burned by Charles's command. To the Christian mystic, it might have seemed more likely that the Church of Christ, his mystical body among the faithful, had entered upon some mysterious phase of its imperishable existence, analogous perhaps to some part of his earthly existence. It had at last become worldwide, and would preach its gospel in every corner of the discoverable world. With that enormous extension of its field and its possibilities, the dark spirit that had followed it with hatred through the catacombs and the long Mohammedan onslaughts into the brightness of the 13th century seemed moving everywhere with a new and more terrible energy to seduce and to destroy. Enormous accumulations of evil problems that made the whole 16th century one of the most disturbed, one of the most fateful in all human history were waiting for Charles and his immediate successors to contend with. Most of them would darken the whole life of the infant Philip. Their twisted shadows already fell about his cradle in the quiet room at Valladolid.